Corla. Minister, the question relates to your plans to introduce legislation to give part-time workers the legal right to seek extra hours. The background is obviously the Dunstores strike, the abuse of 15-hour contracts by that employer, the explosion of zero-hour contracts, and in particular your government's decision to reduce the lone parent allowance, citing circumstances that lone parents could go and get extra hours at work, which obviously they can't do in the absence of any legal entitlement. And I'm wondering what discussions you had with the Minister for Social Protection in that regard.
Minister.
Thanks. I discuss these matters, as Deputy Daly would imagine, with the Taoiseach all of the time. Irish employment rights legislation contains strong safeguards for part-time workers. The Protection of Employees Part-Time Work Act 2001, which is the main piece of legislation governing the employment rights of part-time workers, implemented an EU Council Directive 97/81/EC into Irish law. The purpose of that directive was to implement the framework agreement on part-time work concluded by the European social partners. In general terms, the 2001 Act provides that part-time employees shall not be treated in a less favourable manner in respect of his or her conditions of employment than a full-time employee, and that all employee protection legislation applies to a part-time employee in the same manner as it already applies to a full-time employee. The Act further provides that where a benefit is determined by the number of hours an employee works, it shall be applied on a pro rata or proportionate basis to part-time employees. Further, pursuant to Section 13(5) of the 2001 Act, the Labour Relations Commission prepared in consultation with the social partners a code of practice on access to part-time working. The code was drawn up in the context of Clause 5.3 of the Framework Agreement, which provided that, as far as possible, an employer should give consideration to a request by workers to transfer from full-time work to part-time work and from part-time work to full-time work. Under Section 42(4) of the Industrial Relations Act 1990, the code is admissible in evidence in any proceedings before a court, the Labour Court, the LRC, the EAT or the Equality Tribunal. The Protection of Employees Fixed-Term Work Act 2003 is also relevant. In general terms, the Act provides that fixed-term employees may not be treated less favourably than comparable permanent employees. The Act also establishes a framework to prevent abuses arising from the use of successive fixed-term employment contracts. In addition to these provisions, the Unfair Dismissals Act 1977, as amended, contains a provision aimed at ensuring that successive temporary contracts are not used in order to avoid that legislation. I do not have any plans at this time to amend these provisions, and there is a strong suite of legislative protections in place for part-time workers. My colleague, the Taoiseach and Minister for Social Protection, has responsibility for the one-parent family scheme, payment scheme. The purpose of the phased OFP scheme age change reforms that were introduced in the Social Welfare and Pensions Act 2012 is to reduce long-term social welfare dependency by ending the expectation that lone parents will remain outside of the workforce indefinitely. These reforms aim to provide the necessary supports to lone parents to help them to access the range of education, training and employment programmes provided by the Department of Social Protection to develop their skill sets and ultimately to secure employment and financial independence.
Good morning, Clare Daly.
The Minister says that there are a strong suite of legislative protections for part-time workers, but of course he doesn't address the fact that there aren't any in the area that I'm seeking that there should be. That in the instance where people are on casual contracts, like for instance the Duns situation where you had workers on 15 hours contracts and those hours being used as a method of control by management. Now, Mandate conducted a survey of 1,400 Duns workers, and 85% of workers felt that that was the case. If they spoke up, if they tried to do anything, their hours were spread over 5 days. They couldn't avail of FIS and so on. We have the second highest rate of underemployment in the EU. We have that has gone from 0.8% in 08 to 7% now. The point I'm trying to make, Minister, is your colleague, the Taoiseach, told lone parents that a reduction in their income of between €36 a week and €86 a week on the most vulnerable families in our society could be offset by going to their employers and seeking extra hours. The reality is, in the absence of legislation forcing employers to give them those hours where those hours are available, then that is utter meaningless, and that cut is just butchering their living standards. And you might want to comment on the fact that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, at their conference last week, unanimously voted for a motion along the lines of what this motion here is now, that if you were really serious about the conditions of lone parents, you would be bringing in this very necessary legislation.
Minister.
Yeah, I suppose the overarching point here really is about making work pay and making sure that people can access the hours of work that work for them and to make them financially independent. And it's about much more, of course, than simply getting a weekly or a monthly paycheck. It's about the dignity of work, and it's about dignity at work. It's making your contribution to society. And the overarching, I think, principle informing the reforms introduced by the Taoiseach is to make sure that people are enabled to work for as long as they can and get as many hours as they possibly can to provide for themselves and their families, and to incentivise workers to make sure that work always pays. It's one of the overarching principles as well informing the establishment of the Low Pay Commission, which of course is an important institutional change to tackle low pay from every perspective in a sustained and a structured way, because what we don't want to do is tackle the issue of low pay, which can be a soul-destroying and crushing experience for anybody, in a piecemeal fashion. We need to do it in a structured way. I've gone into some detail in regards to the legislative provisions and the code of practice involved in the area of part-time work, and as the Deputy knows, I am with the University of Limerick carrying out the first comprehensive study of its kind into the extent and prevalence of low-hour contracts in this economy. They will be making recommendations to me as well in the autumn in terms of what legislative changes, or regulatory changes, may need to be required to make sure that work pays, and to make sure that we get into a situation where the jobs that we are creating are good, decent, and sustainable jobs. I think we're achieving. I think we're achieving that. The share of casual and part-time workers on the live register, for example, is down over 9% in June 2014.
I'll come back to the Minister. Deputy Clare Daly.
You're studiously avoiding the issue that casual employment is a serious blight on our society. And the changes brought in by the Taoiseach in relation to lone parents, in the absence of affordable childcare and in the absence of legislation enabling them legally to seek extra hours, then it's the deliberate pauperisation of that section of our society. Now, the CSO reveals that the overwhelming majority of lone parents are either in work or actively seeking work. And unless you bring in something which enables those people to access the extra hours, and not just those people, but to be honest, the Duns workers who have got the sympathy of the nation for the manner in which they've been abused by their employer and their hours being used to denigrate them, to put them in a very precarious situation, and in fact, as Mandate have said, to exercise control, not to mind not having a decent standard of standard of living, is scandalous. It's my understanding as well that an EU directive requires you to bring in such legislation. So I'm a little bit surprised that you haven't got any plans to change it in that regard.
Minister, to conclude.
We have fully transposed the Part-Time Workers Directive, despite the protestations of some, and have done so in consultation a number of years ago with the social partners, including the trade unions, who were satisfied to sign off on that. I think what Deputy Daly, with respect, is studiously avoiding is the fact that this economy has been transformed over the last couple of years, and what we have seen, in fact, is part-time underemployment falling by 40% in the last 2 years, and that's something I think that we need to be conscious of. As I said at the conclusion of my earlier reply, the share of casual part-time workers on the live register is down almost 10%, it's down 9% on June 2014, and that's the equivalent of over 7,000 workers. And all of the evidence suggests that when the economy started to recover, yes, there was a proliferation of part-time jobs, but many of those have migrated into full-time positions, and that's an illustration, I think, of the strength of the economy and the acceleration of the economic recovery. And I think that's something we should all welcome, because ultimately what we're all about, what I'm about and what my party is about providing decent, sustainable jobs for people in this economy.
Thank you,
That's the right route out of poverty.
Deputy Derek Leary has the next question.